Hey there. Well, it's the last week of May, and so it's the last week of Horror Mayhem 2025. And I'm just going to finish up talking about three final stories, horror stories that I read. Again, Horror Mayhem is focused on reading short horror fiction, 250 pages or less. It's a BookTube event started by the Bookish Bryants, and this year's theme is Decades of Dread. So I've been reading some stories spanning the decades from the mid to early 19th century into the 20th century. I never quite made it into the current 21st century. I think the most current I got was 1990. Anyhow, today I'm going to stick in the 20th century for the last three stories, including one big gun writer, horror writer, very famous ghost story writer that I wanted to be sure that I included in this month's reading, and that is M.R. James. And here I have my Penguin Complete Ghost Stories of M.R. James, and this has every single one of his short stories as far as I'm aware, and he wrote a lot of ghost stories. Whole page of contents here, and then a few on the other side. And I've read most of M.R. James's ghost stories. I really like him. There's a reason why he's considered one of the best of the traditional British ghost story writers. Now, before M.R. James, it was pretty common to have really a gothic sense for various ghost stories, but M.R. James takes a different approach. He does quite often tie his ghost stories into ancient history, or at least several years, 100 years previously, sort of events that are maybe behind the various hauntings that occur to his main characters. And most of his main characters are, generally speaking, kind of university dons or researchers or, educated people such as himself, really. But he has a real dry sense of humor, and he keeps kind of a realistic sense, a kind of prosaic feeling or tone to his stories, which gives the ghostly, supernatural aspects a nice kind of relaxed but eerie kind of power of suggestion, sort of spookiness. And if you like that style, you will really like him. And this story that I'm going to talk about today is towards the end of his this book and towards the end of his career, I guess, although he still had several years of life left. And that is The Haunted Doll's House. Now, M.R. James, while he was writing his ghost stories, was the provost, I believe that's how it's pronounced, provost of Eton College, which is a boys' school in England, very famous, Eton. And the provost is kind of a chief executive officer or academic officer of the school. The boys' school is kind of a prep school for boys, very famous one. So M.R. James had a habit of every Christmas or around the Christmas holidays, he would have written a ghost story and he would present it. He would read it to fellow friends and pupils that would gather around in his rooms, and he would have the fire lit and probably had his pipe going, and he would read them this story that he wrote. And then he eventually would publish them. And he started his writing career this way. And so several friends and acquaintances told him, hey, these are really good. You should put them together in a book. And he continued to do that through the rest of his career. And he was a provost at Eton for a long, long time. Now, because of his fame as a ghost story writer, he was approached by Queen Mary, that was George V's wife, the Queen, the grandmother of Elizabeth II, who passed away a little while ago. And she was she was having built a special massive doll's house to put in Windsor Castle. And it was built between the years 1920 and 1924. And then several authors were asked to commission short works to be put in miniature book form to go into the doll's house in the Queen Mary's doll's house. And M.R. James complied with this story, The Haunted Doll's House. Now, the story starts out in a very typical kind of everyday prosaic sort of way, typical of James's style. Mr. Dillett, who's a collector of antiques, is haggling over this doll's house, this beautiful big doll's house, approximately 6 foot wide, a big one. And with the antique dealer, Mr. Chittenden, and Mr. Dillett is rather secretly surprised with how cheaply he's able to purchase this doll's house. And then once he walks away, inwardly rubbing his hands with glee at what a deal he got over on Mr. Chittenden. Mr. Chittenden, the antique dealer's wife, comes up and said, "Is it gone? Thank God. And I'm glad it went to that man, Mr. Dillett." And then Mr. Chittenden says, "Mr. Dillett's not so bad, but I'm very glad to be getting rid of that doll's house myself." And as the story goes on, we realize why they're happy to see the back of it. Now, Mr. Dillett, very excited, has his butler help him carry it upstairs to his room. He likes to surround himself in his giant bedroom at his estate with a lot of his most famous objets d'art and collected antiques. And so he puts the dollhouse on this kind of table near his bed, and then he decides to look in the little drawers under the doll's house, and he sees all these little dishes and plates and bedclothes and costumes and all this stuff and all these little figures that he starts to put into the doll's house in the different rooms. Now, this is a big mansion, several stories, building and wings and a chapel and all that stuff. But in one of the upper rooms, he notices that there's a bed with the curtains drawn around it, one of those big 4-poster beds. And he's why is that closed? And he sticks his finger in there and he feels something strange, almost kind of a living thing. He's like, "What the hell?" And then he opens the curtain and he sees the little doll figure of a little old man. And he takes him out, and then eventually he puts them all in their different places. And very pleased with himself and with his purchase, he goes to bed. Well, in the middle of the night, at 1 o'clock, he's awakened by a chiming bell, like a church bell. Now, there's no church bell around where he lives, so he's startled. What is this sound? And he looks up and he sees, even though there's no light in the room, it's almost like a bright, clear light is showing, moonlight or something is showing on this doll's house. And he begins to see a drama enacted in front of him. And essentially, it's a drama of a murderous plan by the daughter of the old man and her husband to poison the old man. And I'm assuming it's assumed that they want to inherit his estate. And then what happens when something comes back from the grave for revenge. And again, Mr. Dillett is not in any danger himself, but he is watching what occurs. And later he's so unnerved by this that he goes to the seaside to recuperate, and he meets Mr. Chittenden, also doing the same, recuperating from his experience of having had this doll's house in his antique shop for quite a while, and undergoing the same experience every night of watching this drama, this kind of murder and supernatural revenge plot unfold in front of him. And Mr. Dillett gets a few more background details and does some research of his own, and he finds the village and the place where this house stood some 2 centuries before. Very cool story, typical kind of relaxed and realistic sort of approach that James takes, kind of a wry, dry British humor style, but very effective. And when the horror stuff does come, it's quite chilling. It's kind of hinted at, barely seen. Now, James does have some more in-your-face sort of supernatural ghostly manifestations that can be quite scary. This one is maybe not quite up to those as far as on the scariness meter, but it's a very cool, eerie, little chilling story with some little humorous touches here and there. Highly recommended. And that was published. One last note is many other writers contributed stories for the little mini books that go into the library of Queen Mary's Doll's House, including Thomas Hardy and Arthur Conan Doyle and several other prominent writers of the day. And all of them relinquished the copyright to these stories that they wrote specifically for the Doll's House, except M.R. James. who was happy to comply and write a story, but he kept the rights himself, and you published the stories subsequently in his own collection. So this was published in 1923. Now, the next story I want to talk about is from the one and only Robert E. Howard. So I read The Horror from the Mound, which was published. It was turned down by another magazine, but eventually showed up in Weird Tales in the May 1932 issue of Weird Tales. And I read it in this collection, The Haunter of the Ring and Other Stories, Tales of the Mystery and Supernatural. This is a Wordsworth edition. It's got crammed full of a lot of stories in here. I think there's, a good 20 plus stories or so in here. And this is the one I was most curious about because I heard it's one of Howard's better horror tales. Now, Robert E. Howard's stories in general are highly regarded by pulp fiction fans such as myself, but some of his horror stories are considered a little less, at least pure horror stories, considered a little less, valuable or have aged less well, perhaps, than some of his other stories like Conan or Solomon Kane, etc. Now, some of those definitely have horrific aspects, supernatural aspects, for sure. Anyway, Horror of the Mound, cool story. It's basically a Wild West vampire story. It's pretty cool. Anyway, it starts with this, I guess he's a cowboy working on a ranch or farm in some hard scrabble, dry area somewhere in Texas. His name is Steve Brill, and he's about ready to give up his farm. It's not doing very well for him. And near his farm on the land there is a mound, and he thinks it's another Indian burial mound, which are common around parts of the United States. In fact, Brill, a confession which doesn't do him any credit, but talks in the story about having, dug inside these Indian mounds in the past and found various artifacts left by the Native Americans who buried their dead there. Not really a nice aspect to his character, but this is not that kind of mound, frankly, exactly. Now, Brill has a neighbor, one Juan Lopez, who is working the land over the crest of the hill nearby. He's kind of a neighbor of Steve Brill. And he always comes walking through Brill's property on the way to his house from working at a tenant farm that he's toiling at, digging in the hard, dry earth. Sounds like a real tough way to make a living, as presented in this story. And when Lopez comes back from working to go back to his little shack in the valley next door, nearby, he always goes around this mound that's on Brill's property and kind of crossing himself, and really goes out of his way to not even look at it or get anywhere near this mound, like he has some superstitious fear of the place. And Brill's like, hey, Lopez, what's your problem? Why? I notice you always avoid this mound. And then Lopez has said, I'm sworn to secrecy. I can't tell you what's going on there. It's a awful thing. And says, well, why don't you just write it down then, basically. And Lopez is like, oh, that's right. I never promised I couldn't write it down. So he goes back as the shadows wane to write out this tale to tell why that mound is, stay away from it, it's dangerous, etc. What is the myth behind it? But in the meantime, Brill's thinking, I could really use some money. Lopez's attitude is suspicious, like maybe there's something of value in there. He swears it's not an Indian mound, but that it's somehow linked to perhaps a group of conquistadors that were coming through there centuries before. Maybe there's some gold in there. So he gets out a lantern and decide to dig into this mound. Not a good idea. He starts hacking away in there, and it's with his pick and shovel. And first he sees a lot of charcoal around and goes, well, this is not quite like previous Indian burial mounds I've found, but who knows? I still, just in case, I better keep digging. And he digs until he hits concrete or hits something solid like stone. And he sees, basically, he unearths what looks like a big stone vault or crypt. And he starts to it's sealed on the top, so he starts to kind of scrape away around it so that he can try to move it. But he decides he needs some more equipment to be able to get this thing open. So he goes back to his ranch house, And when he's heading back from getting the tools he needs, he goes back towards the mound, and he sees some figure, kind of shadowy figure, loping off through the mesquite on his way towards Juan Lopez's house. And he's thinking, hey, did Lopez follow me and watching me, and he getting involved, getting in there before I did? And he goes back and he smells some kind of foul odor of ancient decay around, and he notices that the lid of this coffin or vault is open and off, and it's empty inside. He's like, oh, Lopez came and got whatever was of value in there, and he took it back to his place. So he starts walking off towards Lopez's shack, but he's got an eerie feeling, a weird feeling. The birds are all quiet and still. There's no insects are still. There's no noise as he goes through this forest, and he feels this kind of weird, clammy disquiet as he goes through. And he's on his way to Lopez's house when he hears an unearthly, terrible scream, a shriek of fear and pain, and then gurgling kind of noise. And he runs up there. He's kind of trying not to. He's not quite processing what he sees. He thinks he sees some kind of shape over Lopez's body, and then he gets in there. Lopez is gone. Someone snuffed out the light, and then he finds Lopez's body with 4 puncture marks in his throat and some blood around there, and he's dead as a doornail, basically. And Brill lights up his, some kind of candle and is looking in there around the place to try to see what's going on, and he notices a bunch of papers scattered around the floor, and he realizes this is what Lopez was writing to tell me about the history of this tomb. And now he's really starting to get a little freaked out. He stashes the papers in his pocket and heads back to his house. And again, he's really creeped out because he still thinks he sees a figure, shadowy figure, kind of sloping off through the trees ahead of him. And he's like, ooh, what's going on? And he gets back to his house, and his little ranch house, and he turns on a lantern, and he starts reading, an oil lamp, and he starts reading this last, I guess, testament of the poor departed Mr. Lopez, who might still be around if Brill hadn't got involved. Anyway, basically the story related is that there was this conquistador, or this kind of exploratory party of Spaniards, and they came on their way to the continent. They had to North America. They came across a ship that was derelict and found this man, this kind of Don, this kind of noble figure that was on the ship. And he said that a plague had taken the crew and he was the last one alive. And they decided, okay, we'll take you along with us. We can't take you back home yet, but we're on our way through to find some gold or whatever. There was a lot of gold taken out of that area around Texas and other Southwest states by the Spaniards back in the day, centuries before. And anyway, as they're going across the land, something mysterious starts happening to this party of explorers, and their numbers start dwindling, and they're finding people dead with puncture wounds in their neck and their blood drained out, etc. And obviously, of course, the man who they found on the boat is a vampire of some sort. And this creature is the one that Brill has released from his tomb. And then Brill looks up from what he's reading, and he sees the face of this hideous creature, contorted and, snarling face at his window, coming to get him. Pretty cool story. And my final horror short story, or I guess novelette length story that I got to, the 26th story I read this month for Horror Mayhem 2025, was The Birds by Daphne Du Maurier, who is most famous, of course, for Rebecca, but this is probably her second most famous work, arguably. And The Birds, of course, is more widely known from the film by Alfred Hitchcock, which does have some similarities, especially in I guess, apocalyptic theme and some elements of set pieces that are similar. But otherwise, this is quite a different story, and it's extremely good. Very good story. Now, Horror in the Mound was published in 1932, the M.R. James story in 1923, and this story was originally published in 1952. And here it's in my Strange Beasts and Unnatural Monsters collection, which is about, animals and various creatures attacking people, causing horror and panic. And that's certainly the case here. As people might guess from having seen the very famous Hitchcock movie, this is about birds revolting against humanity, but it's told in a very realistic and kind of typically British disaster, end of the world style that you can find from writers like John Wyndham and John Christopher and J.G. Ballard, etc. It's a kind of British tradition of kind of stiff upper lip against overwhelming grim odds in its feeling. It's very, very well done. So it's set in Cornwall, which is where Daphne Du Maurier was from. And its main character is Nat Hawken. Now, Nat Hawken is a World War II veteran. He's disabled from, I believe, a bombing in his home, and he moved to the Cornwall area from, I believe, Plymouth. I can't remember exactly where he was from. But he has a wife and 2 young children. Maybe, I'm guessing the daughter Jill is around 8 or so, and his younger son's probably around 3 or 4. Anyway, because of his disability, he can't do normal work, I guess, but Nat works as a farmhand for a local farmer named Mr. Brill, who lives nearby. He's a cheerful fellow and treats Nat well, and Nat works about 3 days a week to earn his keep, doing various odd jobs around the farm. And one day, Nat notices that this terrible, hard, cold snap comes into the weather there. Very unusual. The temperature drops steeply, and he notices a bunch of birds massing around, tons of gulls out in the sea hovering above the waves. At first he thinks they're clouds. They're actually just hordes of gulls. And then later that night, he's home and there's a tap, 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 kind of tapping at the window of his cottage. And his wife's like, Nat, go take care of that. What's going on? And he goes out and sees some bird is kind of tapping its beak against the window pane. Goes back to bed. It's nothing. And then tap, tap, he hears like glass break. And he goes, what? And goes back and kind of opens the window. And then the bird comes in and starts attacking him, trying to peck his eyes out. And he's like, what the hell? He fights it off. And that's the start of slow but incremental attacks. And he tries to talk about this to Mr. Brill, the farmer, and I believe that his name is Jim, the cowhand, and Mrs. Brill, the farmer's wife, and all of them kind of poo-poo, oh, whatever, you just saw the weather's making them act strange. And, Nat's thinking back to, you people don't understand, just like you don't understand what it was like to be in a bombing here in the countryside. You didn't have any bombings. You just know people who were sent or fled from the devastated areas during the blackout, during the World War II bombing, and you don't really know what you're talking about. You haven't experienced this kind of horror, but he has in the past, and so he starts to get prepared as things start to happen, and suspense ratchets up. Things start to escalate, and he realized there's another attack at night from several birds that come into the kids' room and start trying to attack the children, and he gets them out, and he stays and shoves them through the door, and he stays to fight off these birds in the pitch black, and they're biting off pieces of him and scratching him, and he's smacking away with blankets, and then later 50 dead bird bodies on the floor, etc. And then things get worse from there. They're listening to the BBC Wire service, the kind of nightly news. And first the announcer sounds kind of like, whatever, there's some people saying some wacky stories about birds. Who knows what's going on? But very rapidly, things get really bad, and the BBC service cuts out. And it's every man for himself, or in this case, every family for itself. And thanks to Nat's foresight and kind of practical nature, his family is maybe one of the only ones in the area that's still alive after these initial attacks. And what's interesting is there are periods, it's kind of linked to when the tide goes out, I guess, where the birds just sit there and just kind of watch, but they don't do anything. And so there's like a 6-hour period in the middle of the night, like from 2 to 8 a.m., and then in the afternoon time as well. And then the other times, it's full-on assault, and all these birds working together, and they don't care. They're breaking their necks as they dive into the door to try to get through. And pretty soon, even bigger birds like hawks and kestrels with much stronger and deadlier beaks trying to smash their way through. And basically, it's just an onslaught, gradually growing onslaught that Nat has to protect his family against and try to keep everyone alive and their spirits up. And what happens to the neighboring farm, and how are they going to get more food and more fuel for their fire to keep the birds from coming down the chimney. And it's a corker, this story. It's full on. And again, it's written in that kind of relaxed, quiet, but kind of straightforward British style that is so effective with this kind of story, because it's underplaying the horror. It's there, it's definitely there, and it is really a suspenseful story. And it leaves it in a place that is very up in the air, similar to, although perhaps bleaker in some ways, than the Alfred Hitchcock movie. If you've only seen the Alfred Hitchcock movie, you haven't read this story, I highly, highly recommend it. And that's The Birds by Daphne Du Maurier. Really excellently written, and highest recommendation I could possibly give a story like this. I love animal attack, the theme of animal attack stories, and of course this has an apocalyptic sort of edge, and especially when the British authors do their take on this genre or subgenre, it's really good stuff. Related to this, I really highly recommend The Day of the Triffids and other John Wyndham works. I'll get to some of those on my channel at some stage. Other stories of this nature. When you read this kind of story, it's kind of why I think zombie TV shows and movies and stories are so popular these days, is there's a real what would you do in this situation sort of quality to them that makes them really captivating. So recommend all three of these stories without reservations, especially The Birds, but The Haunted Doll's House is great, and The Horror from the Mound is a real fun pulpy read in that Robert E. Howard style that if you know what it's like, then you're going to want more of it. And if you haven't tried one, I recommend it. Okay, so that does it for me for May 2025 Horror Mayhem. This was a fun event. I enjoyed reading through all these different stories. Like I said, I got through 26 of them. Got a lot of short stories, polished out of the way. Some of them I've read before, but only a very few. The Wellman stories in particular I've read before. Most of these were first-time reads, and that was a lot of fun to kind of dig my way through some of my collections of horror tales, classic horror tales. So for the few of you who are watching, I hope you enjoyed getting maybe exposed to a few stories you are not so familiar with, and I hope you'll seek them out. We'll see about any other horror stuff I might review down the road, but of course, June on the Range is just around the corner, so I will be switching my focus to Westerns, as well as reading some other things on my own. So I'm looking forward to that. Until my next video, I will catch you later. Enjoy your reading, and we'll see you the next time.